The morning of October 3rd, 1945, breaks cold and gray over Farnborough airfield, the mist still clinging low across the runway as ground crews wheel out a strange, wingless-looking aircraft with a stubby fuselage and swept wings unlike anything British pilots have ever flown. The air smells of aviation fuel and wet grass, and somewhere in the distance a Merlin engine coughs to life on another aircraft. Its growl a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the machine, now being fueled with careful, gloved hands. This is the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet, a captured German rocket interceptor, and today, officers from Britain's Royal Aircraft Establishment are about to discover just how close they've come to strapping themselves into a flying bomb. The Second World War had ended just months earlier, but the race to understand Germany's most radical aviation technology was only beginning. Allied intelligence teams had spent the war's final years sweeping through captured airfields, factories, and research facilities, gathering aircraft, documents, and engineers before Soviet forces could claim them first. Among the prizes seized was the Me 163, a swept-wing, tailless rocket plane capable of climbing to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes, faster than any propeller aircraft the Allies possessed. On paper, it was a marvel. In practice, German pilots who flew it called it something else entirely, a coffin with wings. The Komet's secret lay in its engine, a Walter HWK 109-509 rocket motor that burned 2 separate chemicals to produce thrust. One was T-Stoff, a concentrated hydrogen peroxide solution. The other was C-Stoff, a mixture of hydrazine hydrate and methanol. Individually, both were dangerous. Combined, even by accident, they exploded on contact. German ground crews had learned this the hard way, losing men to fuel leaks that dissolved flesh on contact and to explosions that vaporized aircraft on the runway before they ever left the ground. Pilots wore specially treated suits meant to protect against T-Stoff splashes, but the protection was far from perfect. Now it was Britain's turn to find out exactly what they'd captured. Test pilots at Farnborough, men who had already survived years of aerial combat, approached the Komet with a mixture of fascination and dread. Among them was a young Royal Navy pilot named Eric Brown, already earning a reputation as one of the most skilled and fearless aviators in Britain, a man who would go on to fly more different aircraft types than anyone in history. He had heard the rumors about this machine. He had read the intelligence reports. But reading about a rocket plane and climbing into one were two very different things. What exactly made this aircraft so lethal wasn't just its explosive fuel. It was something built into the very shape of the fuselage, a design choice so dangerous that German pilots feared it more than enemy fire. British engineers were about to find out why, and Eric Brown was about to become one of the few Allied pilots to ever take the Komet into the sky. The ground crew at Farnborough moved around the Komet with a caution usually reserved for unexploded ordnance, and for good reason. Before any Allied pilot would risk igniting that volatile rocket fuel, engineers decided to test the aircraft's flight characteristics the safer way, towed aloft as a glider, its rocket motor dry and silent. Eric Brown climbed into the cramped cockpit, strapped himself into a seat surrounded by dials he had never seen before, and felt the tow cable go taut beneath him. The Komet lurched forward on its wheeled takeoff dolly, gathering speed across the runway. And then, in one violent motion, the dolly dropped away and Brown was airborne, sitting atop a fuel tank the size of a small car with nothing but a thin metal skin between him and disaster. Even without rocket power, the Komet revealed its dangerous nature almost immediately. The aircraft's swept wings and tailless design made it wildly unstable at low speeds, prone to snapping into a spin with little warning. Brown later described the sensation as flying something that wanted to kill him even when it wasn't trying to. And that was before factoring in what happened at the end of every flight, because the Komet didn't land like any conventional aircraft. It had no proper landing gear. Instead, pilots brought it down on a single retractable skid, sliding along the runway at speeds that could shatter a man's spine if the touchdown wasn't perfect. German pilots had faced this same nightmare for years. Rocket ace Mano Ziegler, who flew Komets in combat, wrote in his memoirs about pilots landing hard enough to suffer severe spinal compression injuries, some crippled for life by a single rough touchdown. But the skid wasn't even the worst danger. If a pilot returned from a mission with fuel still sloshing in the tanks, unburned T-stuff and C-stuff could mix during a hard landing and detonate instantly, turning the aircraft and its pilot into a fireball on the runway. German ground crews had watched this happen more than once. It was a fear that never left a Komet pilot's mind, not during takeoff, not during combat, and especially not during landing. So why would Germany build something this dangerous? The answer lay in desperation. By 1944, Allied bombing raids were devastating German cities, and the Luftwaffe needed an interceptor that could reach enemy bombers before conventional fighters ever could. The Komet's rocket motor gave it a rate of climb nearly triple that of a Spitfire, letting it slash through bomber formations in seconds. But that speed came at a brutal cost. Powered flight time lasted barely 8 minutes before the fuel ran dry, leaving the pilot to glide home in an aircraft that handled like a falling brick. British engineers studying the wreckage of downed Komets and interrogating captured Luftwaffe pilots began piecing together a fuller picture. This wasn't just an aircraft. It was a weapon born from panic, engineered with such extreme performance that safety had been abandoned entirely. And Eric Brown, gliding silently above Farnborough with an empty fuel tank, was about to discover exactly how far that panic had gone, because somewhere in Germany, records existed showing just how many young pilots this machine had already killed before a single Allied bomber round was ever fired at them. Back on the ground, British intelligence officers pored over captured German records, and what they found confirmed every fear the glide tests had raised. Of the roughly 300 Me-163 Komets built, historians estimate that far more pilots died from accidents, fuel explosions, and landing injuries than were ever lost in actual aerial combat. The rocket plane built to protect German skies had become, for many who flew it, a greater threat than the enemy it was designed to fight. Some pilots reportedly refused to fly it after witnessing a fellow airman incinerated on the runway. Others flew anyway, driven by orders, by desperation, or by the simple belief that Germany had no better options left. Eric Brown eventually did more than glide the Komet. He became one of the only Allied pilots to fly it under full rocket power, igniting that same volatile fuel mixture that had killed so many German airmen. He later described the acceleration as nothing short of violent, a force that pinned him back into his seat as the aircraft rocketed skyward at a climb rate that dwarfed anything the Allies possessed. For a few exhilarating seconds, he understood exactly why German commanders had gambled everything on this design. And then, just as quickly, the fuel ran out, and he was left gliding a twitchy, unstable airframe back toward a runway that offered no margin for error. That contradiction defined the entire Komet program. It was simultaneously the fastest interceptor of its era and one of the most lethal aircraft ever handed to its own pilots. British test reports concluded that while the rocket engine concept showed genuine promise, the aircraft's instability, its brutal skid landings, and its explosive fuel combination made it unsuitable for any air force that valued pilot survival. It wasn't defeated by superior enemy design. In many ways, it was defeated by its own volatility, a machine that consumed its pilots even when it succeeded in its mission. What British engineers took from those Farnborough tests didn't end with the war. The data gathered from flying and analyzing the Komet fed directly into postwar research on swept-wing aerodynamics and rocket propulsion, knowledge that would echo forward into early jet and rocket-powered test programs on both sides of the Atlantic. In a strange way, the very dangers that made the Komet a death trap also made it an invaluable, if grim, teacher. Standing on that Farnborough runway in late 1945, watching ground crews drain the last of the T-stuff from a captured German rocket plane, it's hard not to feel the weight of what that aircraft represented. It was innovation pushed past the edge of reason, speed purchased with the lives of the young men who trusted it. The Me-163 Komet remains one of aviation history's starkest reminders that a machine capable of extraordinary performance can also be extraordinarily unforgiving, and that the line between breakthrough and disaster is sometimes measured in nothing more than a few seconds of unstable flight. If this story of desperation, courage, and dangerous innovation moved you, let us know in the comments which details stayed with you the most, and consider subscribing for more untold stories from the history of flight.